of campaigns around those issues. I remember vividly visiting him and his law offices in the suburbs in Bundoora, if I'm not mistaken, in about 1980. This was to ask him for support for an application for funding from the Victoria Law Foundation that we were making for an innovative poverty law practice that's being established in Footscray. He gave that support immediately and became effectively a patron of that endeavour. That organisation became the Western Region Community Legal Centre, now West Justice. So it was a successful intervention by him. On being appointed a lecturer in legal studies at La Trobe University, I became the director of the West Heidelberg Legal Service, which was based in the housing estate in West Heidelberg. A brilliant example of post-war housing reconstruction. Perhaps there were some issues with the quality of the build, which remain today, but after it was used to house Olympic athletes, it became the homes for thousands of people whom it was my pleasure and my duty to serve in my capacity as the director of their legal centre. In human rights terms, the government acted then consistently in making available housing for human rights, and I applaud it. It wasn't of adequate quality as we would now see it, but it was a step forward nonetheless. John Cain took great interest in all this. He took great interest in the legal service. He came onto the board after he left politics, and I had a bit to do with him in that capacity. I learnt from him a lot. He was really the first senior politician with whom I had anything to do. He was diligent, he was committed, he was intelligent, and he really appreciated when change was needed and what needed to be done to get it done. He was prepared to advocate for it with courage and persistence, and his influence on me has been enduring, and I hereby honour it. Due in part to that influence, I am here today speaking about the subject of housing and human rights at a time when change is definitely needed. Normally in an address like this I'd lay the case for why it's a crisis or a disaster, as I prefer to call it, but in fact it's generally agreed that we're in terrible trouble in this area, and I can pretty much overlook the foundation laying. I would prefer to call it a disaster because to my mind a crisis is something that happens from time to time in an otherwise well-functioning system, and there's absolutely nothing well-functioning about the system that we've got today. While there's little dispute over the existence of this crisis or disaster, I am calling for a different framing of its causes, its consequences, and the potential solutions for it. The existing ways of framing the problem are, in my view, outdated. They neither fully explain the nature, cause and consequences of the problem, nor do they propose complete or enduring solutions. I want to offer a different kind of framing, one unusual in this country, it must be said, one based on human rights. In doing so, I'm drawing on the tradition that I believe John Cain represented: new ideas, stronger ideals, courage, better and more evidence-based ways of thinking about the causes of problems and possible solutions. Let me begin with a critique, necessarily in summary form, of the existing framing. How do most people currently see the problem? I think most people think that government in Australia has taken its eye off the ball and that that's the big problem. In the period of rights-based public housing construction following World War II, the eye of the government was very much on the ball. Its aim was to increase owned or rented housing for ordinary people, and I celebrate Chifley and Curtin and others involved in that endeavour at that time. After that, government deliberately moved housing policy towards private ownership as the aim. Public housing was let drift and then run down. Tenancy as a form of tenure was stigmatised as second class. It was under-regulated within a framework of property-based, not home-based laws. In Victoria, however, John Cain's government began the long and still completed journey for changing that. I was a small part of that process in the early days, and I remember his role well. Other jurisdictions have followed this lead, but there is a long way to go, even here. In the neoliberal age of the 1990s and thereafter, this narrow private vision of housing sharpened even more, aided by massive tax cuts for investors in housing. What trickled down was inequality and homelessness, ever increasing in this land of plenty, to our shame. Historians of and commentators on Australia's housing system have told this story well. There have been plenty of whistleblowers, a number of true prophets, but nobody was listening. According to this widely held view, the solution to the problem is improved supply-side policy development and action. How often have you heard this is fundamentally a question of supply? More homes need to be built, whether that be by the private sector or by the public sector. In what proportion, that depends on your political outlook, which also determines what other kinds of policy levers might be pulled. The need for tenancy law reform is more widely accepted than any other time, certainly in my working life, but at a certain high and unsatisfactory level of generality. For some, other necessary measures include the supply of, increasing the supply of building labour, reducing bottlenecks of various kinds in the building industry, rezoning planning laws, reducing taxation expenditures that distort the housing market in favour of those who already have land or wealth. What is wrong with this view of things? Well, it depends on your frame of reference, and I'm contending for a human rights frame of reference. Within this frame of reference, this widely held framing of the Australian housing disaster is not adequate. It is policy-based, not right-based, and therefore subject to change. Sure, examples abound within this discourse of early references and speeches to the human right to housing, which seems to suggest that the policy discourse is based upon human rights, but in fact it's not. After that kind of cursory noting, typically there is nothing more on that momentous aspect of Roosevelt's four great freedoms. The freedom from what? The dominant approach speaks the language and announces the limited aspirations of greater funding endeavour, not system transformation. It is much influenced by Australia's three-year electoral cycle at the federal level, for which we as a nation are to blame. It does not look to the long term. It is not person-centred or needs-based, at least not based on fully meeting human need. The measure of success is how many extra homes are built by comparison with the oh-so-impoverished standard of the nation's prior performance. It is reinforced by governmental arrangements which concentrate power in the hands of Treasury officials and which reject the need for freestanding housing departments. To the general community, it has the appearance of experts speaking technical language among themselves. This was most recently represented by last week's ABC Q&A on housing. Familiar ideas with familiar limitations were recycled by politicians and experts before an audience of highly experienced civil society knowledge holders who knew better but were not represented on the panel. I'm not one to allow the perfect to get in the way of the good. I am not decrying the importance of policy development for addressing the complex and pressing issues raised by the Australian housing disaster. Other pressing issues would demand priority if the solution posed by the current approaches were likely to succeed. Here, however, we must decide what the measure of success should be. Better deciding for ourselves what the measure of success should be, than a poor measure of success being imposed upon us by loud voices defending the status quo because we fail to stand counted on our nation's moral watch. This brings me to human rights, on which I argue our measure of success, indeed our whole methodology, should be based. As I set out in the book which Emma mentioned, Australia has an obligation under international law to ensure the right to adequate housing for everybody in Australia. It is a universal human right. This is not yet part of Australian domestic law, although I argue, with others, it should be. It would be if the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Bill 2024 No. 2 proposed by Senator David Pocock and Kylea Tink MP were supported. The bill has been referred to the Senate Standing Committee on Economics for report. Troublingly, the committee is not yet proposing public hearings as part of the consideration process, and there should be public hearings as a part of the consideration of the process. The right to hearing would be part of domestic law if the recommendations of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights were accepted. They are under consideration by the federal government. So, we have a right to housing presently based on international law, not yet domesticated in Australia. Nonetheless, it is a powerfully important and influential right, one that Australia recognises, to which much reference is made. When participants in public debate refer to the right to housing, it's this right to which they are referring. Here in Australia, the only liberal democracy without comprehensive human rights legislation, but endorsing that right at the international law level. Here in Australia, how do we understand the right to adequate housing? What does it mean? The purpose of the right to adequate housing is to enable people to flourish in all the dimensions of their lives. For this to happen, adequate housing is obviously absolutely indispensable. The fundamental value which the right expresses is equal and universal human dignity. Ensuring the well-being of all persons individually and collectively is the ultimate end to which all human rights, including the right to adequate housing, are directed. No person should be treated as the means of the ends of others is a foundational principle of human rights. That principle has deeply historical origins. In relation to the housing system, we might say that people's housing needs should therefore come before profit. The fundamental interest which the right to adequate housing protects is having a peaceful, secure and safe place to live. A decent home is not just a roof over your head, important as this is. It is having a home that is affordable, that is safe, meets certain minimum physical conditions and standards, is accessible, is reasonably close to essential services like health, education and transport, and obviously employment. Other essential standards are discussed in the book by reference to the applicable UN documents. If these standards are met, adequate housing can be private or public. It can be owned or rented, and as the need requires, short, medium or long term. This way of understanding housing as a human right characterises people with housing needs, that is to say everybody, as rights bearers and governments as a duty holder. The right and the duty are laws, not just in policies. The role of policy is to give effect to the right in public administration, about which democratically governments have a wide margin of system choice. Of course, under the right to adequate housing, government does not have an obligation to give everybody in Australia a home. But progressively, over time, within the limits of its resources, government must create a housing system which ensures that everybody can have adequate housing, whatever be their individual means. This may be through a system having different parts, for example, home ownership, social housing, rental housing, and emergency or homeless housing as we have now, but it must be done. And through an integrated planning process reflecting a human rights-based approach, which is a whole other topic of discussion I need to omit. From a human rights perspective, applying that reasoning, what do we make of the Australian housing disaster? This. It is not just an economic or a political or a housing disaster. It is a human rights disaster because government has absolutely failed to fulfil its obligation to fulfil the human right to housing for all. It has been over a generation in the making, and it will be a generation plus in the resolving, it looks like. It is a human rights disaster because millions of people have not been able to afford affordable housing, owned or rented, because they have been living in housing stress, often extreme, because their housing is not peaceful, safe and secure, because they are living in poverty or near so due to the cost of housing, because they're at risk of living or are living in homelessness. 120,000 people plus, of course, are actually homeless in Australia. And because rental laws do not give effect to basic human rights standards, such as security of tenure. All of these situations involve human rights violations which government is bound to prevent. Age, gender, race and other characteristics magnify the impact of these violations for people in those categories. Again, time does not permit me to develop that argument. Presently, all publicly announced policies by government at all levels are aimed at ameliorating this situation, not resolving it. They are not aimed at progressively, over time, within the limits of government resources, creating a housing system which ensures that everyone can have adequate housing, as is their human right. The policies are not based on meeting the needs of all people for housing, but only some. Millions will be left behind. The measures announced, while welcome and well exceeding prior impoverished government efforts, are not nearly enough to do two fundamental things. One, address current and growing housing needs, and two, addressing the housing stress and homelessness legacy issues that have built up in the system after more than a generation of neglect. As one authoritative source in support of this conclusion, I refer to the first report of the National Housing and Supply Council entitled State of the Housing System. It was issued in 2023. The findings of this report have not been disputed. The report finds that the federal government's announced housing supply initiatives, even if fully implemented, would not resolve significant supply shortfalls within the ordinary supply and demand cycle in the outlook period. I quote the Council: "Shortfalls in new supply relative to new demand will add to the already significant undersupply of housing in the system in the absence of significant changes in housing policy or the capacity of the housing sector to supply new dwellings. As a result, housing affordability is expected to deteriorate further over the forecast horizon." As to unmet legacy needs, the report finds that significant unmet need and affordability pressures have already accumulated in the present system. The initiatives would not meet these needs it found. Again, I quote, "There will be no surplus of new housing supply to address the significant unmet need for housing that currently exists due to affordability constraints or to accommodate the 122,000 Australians experiencing homelessness." In short, existing government policy announcements about increased supply will not meet, I repeat, one, the demand for housing expected in the ordinary course during the outlook period, and two, the legacy needs built up in the system, including those arising from housing stress and high homelessness. That is to say, present government approaches will not fulfil its obligation to realise the right to adequate housing of every Australian. For a moving account of what this will mean for the millions of Australia who will be left behind, I recommend that you read Voices of the Crisis, final report from the People's Commission into Australia's housing crisis, published by Everybody's Home in 2024. Senator Doug Cameron served on that commission. In conclusion, a human rights-based approach to the Australian housing disaster would be based on nobody being left behind, because the right belongs to everybody equally. Applying this approach, government would be obliged progressively over time within the limits of its resources to create a housing system which ensures that everyone can have adequate housing, whatever be their means. To do this, a legislated national housing and homelessness plan based on realising the human right to housing would be needed. A policy-based plan would not be enough. This is the rationale of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Bill 2024 number 2 that I mentioned is before the Australian Parliament, and in my view something like that should be supported. Thank you for your attention.
All right, I'm traffic cop, so I know we're going to have lots of comments and questions today. Who's going to start us off? Oh, don't let me down. You're always so...
My memory stretches back to 2012, but only just. Justice Mokgoro was here from South Africa, M-O-K-G-O-R-O.
Yes. Yes.
I was in the audience.
Yes.
It was a stunning presentation.
Mm-hmm.
She was saying, and I hope you've got a memory,
Mm-hmm.
it's housing, it's water, it's electricity, gas, whatever.
All of that.
There was a bundle of rights for decent living that were built into their constitution. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So as part of the transformation of undemocratic South Africa into democratic South Africa, there was a constitutional settlement with the white population, and that settlement resulted in the constitution that you've mentioned. The constitution specifies a suite of human rights, one of which is the right to housing, which you are quite right to point out involves a bundle of necessary elements: power, water, services, proximity to things, protection from the elements, and so on and so forth. South Africa adopted the direct enforcement route so that it's possible, and it's happening today, for NGOs to work with housing organisations on the ground and bring actions in court against government to try to bring about an improvement in their housing situation in their local area. Due to a series of cases beginning quite soon after the Constitution was adopted, the court has identified principles which incidentally have been adopted in Europe where similar rights exist, whereby it doesn't itself cause the delivery of housing to a populace counting in the many millions, but rather establishes a framework of principles within which government must do that. Government is held to account through these processes, and opinions vary about how effective it is in a small country with limited resources and housing needs are so great. But my own observation is that the legal constitutional right to housing in South Africa has been an important part through which the just aspirations for the realising of the right to housing of South Africans can be met.
Thank you. We're increasingly told, repeatedly told, that the housing crisis is a result of population increase. But when we look at it, we see that population increase is being paralleled by a decrease in household size. I'm not sure what the average household size now is.
2.1.
2.1, thank you. I can remember the day when a household consisted of mum and dad and the kids and grandma and uncle and the boarder who lived in the caravan out in the backyard. So if we could revert to those sorts of household sizes, it seems to me that the housing crisis would vanish overnight. What is the link between government policy and household size? I suspect it has to do with the taxation system, the social welfare system, the benefits system. What apparatus can government bring to bear on getting grandma and uncle and the boarder back into the household?
I grew up in social housing. I was born in 1954 of poor working parents with their 8 children within 10 years. our grandparents were indeed out the back in a bungalow. There was a floating population of uncles and aunts in distress coming through the household, and that home was built, for which I'm extremely grateful, by Curtin and Chifley, who created the Commonwealth Housing Commission, and the system through which my family could grow up. So I really appreciate the reference that you've made to household sizes back then. I'm not here to pick policy winners, and I'm not going to engage in discussion about the millions of brilliant ideas that are out there in relation to how to improve household number, how to do this or to do that. It's not because the ideas are not good, they are. It's not because the point that you've just made is not a good point, it is. It's because I'm here to make a different and bigger point. And the bigger and different point I want to make is that any of these ideas need to be judged against human rights standards. Now these standards cut both ways, if I might say, because persons, in their 70s who've grown up in a household where the nest is emptied, in circumstances where they're completely comfortable with their home, even though it might be a bit too big for them now, have a right to home, to dignity, to proximity with services that they enjoy, to social supports with their familia, on which their lives may actually depend, literally depend. And so we're in a situation where sometimes rights compete. The right of the sitting owner to home versus the right of somebody who hasn't got a home to a home. And it's easy to think, well, we can solve that by shifting people in homes that are too big for them out. I know that's not what you're suggesting. You're looking for policy levers to bring that about. I'm saying, yes, that's an idea along with many others, but we need to apply human rights in order to the resolution of the human problems that those ideas raise. And that one, I think, is a good example of where human rights are needed because the rights are competing. Lucy. Hi.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much.
My former associate.
It's wonderful to see you.
You too.
My question is, I suppose, in a way complementary to that, because it's about the role of housing in the well-being and health of children.
Yeah.
There's of course a lot of emphasis on increasing density for environmental reasons and other reasons, but I think something that often gets lost or seems to be pushed to the side is that higher density, is rightly something that many parents are concerned about, because they're concerned about the impact that will have on their ability to give their children a healthy lifestyle, particularly when the surroundings of many of these high density developments just are completely inimical to children moving around independently. There's no traffic kind of management, there's no infrastructure built to allow children to leave the place without parental supervision, which when both parents are working full time is really, really hard to achieve. So I want to know what you think can be done to inject more of a child focus into some of these housing debates, because that's something that really concerns me for obvious immediate reasons.
Yeah.
Not just the impact that this housing crisis is going to have on the current generation of kids when they try to buy their home, but what impact it's having on them right now in terms of their health and well-being.
I think I'm not going to engage again with specific examples. What I want to do is to talk about how the interests that you've pointed to are better resolved within a human rights framework. Now, the interest that you've referred to is the interest of children to playing space, which is absolutely fundamental for their psychological development, and counts as part of their human rights interests as developing children in several ways. But let me tell you, I visited my granddaughter Aminagilda in Berlin a month ago. She lives in no man's land, actually, between where the two walls were. Between the two walls in Berlin, fabulous housing has been built. Medium density, a mix of private and public, a mix of people, of tenure forms and so on. she chose to live with her partner there because she's had her first child just then. That's why I went there. Although it's medium density, she's got a childcare care centre within 500 metres, walking metres of where she lives. They don't have to have a car because you just go out the front door and there's a row of cars that you can use by clicking it's a rental system. You just use an app. Overlooking looking out their window is acres of space, really well organised. Children's playgrounds that would make your heart sing. Places for bicycles to be stored, so that you don't have to store it in your own home, and so on and so forth. So I think it depends. All depends on how it's done. I strongly agree with the identification of the human rights interests that you have made, but there are clearly many other human rights interests involved, including, importantly, the interests we all have in a planning system that enables the human right to housing to be realised, not just for some but for everybody. If we have, when I speak to planners about this issue, they say if we're at the moment, planning is essentially a geographical exercise, heavily influenced by development principles. It's as if the land has a personality and a right to development. That's the way that they speak. They say if we put the human right to housing in planning systems, then these issues can be resolved in a way that is more effective, more sensitive to the needs of human persons than it currently is. No one wants to see children grow up with no sunshine. Nobody wants that to happen. But we all want there to be places within which people can grow up in peace, in dignity and security. Is that your daughter? Yes. Jago.
The mic, Jago, so that people at home can hear you.
Thank you. So I know a bit about housing, but not a great deal about human rights law.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is about the mechanisms through which human rights are enforced or realised through our system of government. Because if you're talking about international human rights law, then obviously the Commonwealth has a role in that. But does that include, in the way that we have in, say, discrimination law, that now is an obligation of private businesses and other organisations not to discriminate against their employees? Would a human right to housing filter through various parts of the constitutional diagram, the civil society, business, government parts of the diagram, and who then is responsible for the human right to housing? Is it just the Commonwealth or a multiplicity of actors?
Okay, well that's a really good question, a complex question. I'm going to do my best to answer that question. The human rights are obligations on government, but at all levels. The human right to housing in the International Covenant, to which we subscribe, is one that applies to all levels of government, all public agencies. So that means federal, state, local government. It means every public entity. So that's the first point. The second point is that right is not enforceable as such in Australia because it's an international right, not a domestic right. As Lucy will know, it does influence domestic law in certain respects, but for present purposes we can ignore all that. It's not enforceable here. It doesn't mean that it's not relevant here, because we've just had, I hope, a useful discussion about the role of human rights in relation to a very important area of Australian public life. But it's not enforceable here. In the manner in which it should be made enforceable involves selecting from a kind of menu from the soft to the hard. The softest form of human rights incorporation in a country is mere recognition. An act says somewhere every person in Australia has a right to adequate housing, preferably I would think involving the following elements, full stop. A powerfully emblematic but only symbolic way of doing it. Highly problematic in terms of resolving a housing disaster of the dimensions that we have here. Highly problematic. Next would be the creation of the right to housing in human rights acts of the kind that we have in Victoria, the ACT, and in Queensland, and which it is hoped will be established at the federal level and in the other states and the other territory. That would involve an obligation on the part of government and government agencies of all kind, but not the private sector, an obligation to take human rights into account in making decisions and in acting to do things. It would also affect the way that laws are interpreted. That's proved to be useful, progressive, and to advance the situation in states like Victoria in relation to the rights there specified. The rights there specified don't include housing at the moment. I'm talking about the choosing from the menu. But if we include that, then we get rights-mindedness increased at the government level, which is helpful. We get a certain degree of legal power through legal action, but not much. So it's a non-threatening, but middle of the road kind of way of bringing the human right to housing into the picture. Now, the next step, greater in power, having a stronger impact upon government administration, is the concept informed by human rights and informed by the human rights-based approach, which I could only but mention, is a national housing and homelessness plan. This is a big multi-government instrument, much more aspirational and much stronger in content than the current agreements between the states, which are just funding agreements, as the Productivity Commission pointed out. It should be based on the right to housing. That should be in legislation. The government should have the obligation to realise that right through that plan. There would need to be supervisory mechanisms. They needn't be judicial. They could be. In other places they are. The bill before the Senate at the moment proposes that. It's based on the Canadian equivalent. A number of institutions through which accountability and participation is achieved are established under the legislation. But it doesn't come with legal enforceability. So we go the next step along the way, and then we come back to South Africa and the 40 or so countries of the world where this is possible. The right's constitutionalised. It's made in order to increase the capacity of individuals to take control of their own destiny with respect to human rights, for example, housing. A right of action is conferred upon them to go to court, hold the government to account, and so on. Now, this can be done at the individual level. You have not realised my right to housing, and you should. Or it can be done at the system level. Uganda, the climate change case in the Netherlands. The children went to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands and they said, you, the government, have not adopted a system through which our right to life will be the main issue in relation to climate policy. The court agreed, and that's led to some extraordinary orders to the government, which the government has accepted, about doing things differently. Now, I'm certainly not arguing in this country where we don't have a national Bill of Rights, let alone a constitutional right to practically anything. We do have a constitutional right to democracy, which is something very big indeed. But I'm here talking about individual human rights. I'm not advocating here that we should have a constitutional right to housing, and I'm not even saying that there should be, with one exception, that there should be an individual right which can be used to go to court so that individuals can get what they need in order to be able to live. I am saying, however, that homeless people should have the right to go to court in order to get an order for housing. It is an absolutely fundamental breach of a whole suite of human rights for people to be homeless. And I can begin with the right to life. The average age of a person experiencing homelessness is 53. That's 30 years less than a person not experiencing that condition. It's a life-threatening experience for people to have. And so I do think that particularly seeing how non-systemic is the current approach to the housing disaster we're experiencing, how likely it is that it will continue, how likely it is that homelessness will remain as high as it is, I think there's a strong case for equipping homeless people with the right to get housing, emergency, medium term, wraparound services, housing first and so on, so they can be resettled back into the community. I hope that helps.
Hugh Belfrage, BNF Housing.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful work.
Pleasure. It's our privilege. I'd like to acknowledge the Capita's wonderful work as well. I'm really interested in your thoughts. This follows on from Jada's question really about steps. I'm sure you appreciate the political complexity of the housing situation.
Of course.
What are some next steps? Like, it's a powerful frame that you've presented today.
Mm-hmm.
Something that everyone here agrees with. How do we most effectively advance that frame to our leaders and to the community? I know there's no whole answer, but I'm interested in your thoughts, maybe drawing on some of John Kane's, of the things you learned from John.
Well, I don't assume that everybody necessarily agrees with all aspects of what I'm saying today, and I'm grateful for the attention that has been given to me. As to next steps, I accept that we are at an early stage in this national discourse, which I think needs to broaden and deepen. I am really grateful to Emma and her team at Per Capita for giving me the opportunity to present this to you today. I'm accepting a degree of personal responsibility for this. One is that I consider I'm part of the group of people who should be on moral watch because the situation is really very bad. And secondly, because I grew up in public housing, as I've recently said. So I can only say to you that each of you will have connections. Each of you will have the capacity in one way or another to repeat what I've done today. I took the trouble to write this out for you today, and I'll give this to you once I've edited it. See all sorts of little things in there, as one does, and have a look at that and republish it. I think what I would say is be on moral watch, because the situation is that urgent.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. I'm Mel from Medical Legal. So,
congratulations on your work.
Thank you. So, the human rights approach to solve human problems makes total sense to me and probably a lot of people here. There has been some research that says, in terms of the message of the frame, housing as a human right becomes less effective, I guess, the more abstract it gets, as compared to framing it as a home or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's the approach of coming up with the framework, using that to design a policy, that makes sense. But from a compelling point of view, how do you see the role of human right in?
Sure. Well, I think the premise of your question is that Australia is a relatively immature human rights jurisdiction, and that's true. We are the last liberal democracy to have even a statutory comprehensive human rights framework, and that says a lot. That doesn't mean that we are a rights disrespecting country across the board, because there are many freedoms which we have, which we cherish and which are respected, including the most fundamental of all, which is democracy itself. But that being said, I do accept the premise of the question that there is that human rights advocacy has to take into account the level of understanding within the broader community of human rights questions. I absolutely accept that. But in this lunch, in this address, I'm addressing people of a certain level of commitment and interest. That's perfectly obvious. And so I think that it is really necessary to answer the kind of questions which Jayo asked, which is, well, how does this actually work in practice? What does it mean for government? What are the linkages? What's the content of a human right? Where does it come from? How is it to be understood? Important questions of content. Now, I don't like to run away from those, and so here I'm in this kind of audience, on this kind of occasion, not engaged in the issue of messaging. I'm engaged in the issue of persuasion. I'm trying to get a message across to a sophisticated audience at a level of detail which I think is important. Now, that's got to happen on a very large scale. It has to be really scaled up before we can be ready to think that fundamental change will actually occur. I think it will. I think an historical moment happened when the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights accepted the recommendation of the Human Rights Commission for a comprehensive legislative Charter of Rights or Bill of Rights, which would include the socio-economic rights, including the right to housing. I think that was a really important moment, and I applaud the people on the committee, being Labor and the Greens, who went along, who supported that. I think it was absolutely momentous. But much like that has to happen before we get to the messaging stage. Once we get there, I think the point that you make is a good one. Renata.
I was just wondering about gender issues.
Yeah.
Because I think these are very important in terms of looking at the housing issue. Because, you know, my assumption is
yes.
that women of a certain age, probably, both young and old, are particularly affected by housing, you know, and their access to housing. If they're not in a family situation, if they're on their own.
Thank you. There are several important intersectionality issues in this area that I didn't have time to discuss, but I'm grateful for the question because it enables me to do so. The most important is the gender one. There are several dimensions to it. One is the problem of domestic and family violence in the home, causing women to need to flee from that place which should be their safe place to very often an unsafe place, being their car in too many situations, sometimes with children. So that that's a violation of their right to housing, plain bread. $5 billion was announced last week as a package to support a package of measures directed to that. I applaud that, but it's not being done within a human rights framework, so that the package is not knitted together with other things that are needed. We need to change the housing system so that people, women, don't have to flee their own homes. That involves linkages with other parts of government. Another really serious aspect of the problem is that the group of people most at risk of homelessness in Australia are older women. And there is a very good documentary on this called Undercover. Just put in Undercover and you'll see it. and 6 brave women shared their story with the presenter of homelessness. They had different trajectories towards their difficulties. Husbands losing their money, husbands passing away, various things. But because of the unequal life course through which they passed, they arrived in their latter years in a position of much greater vulnerability than other people. For example, men who continue work. And that's a major problem to which there should be solutions that take into account their particular needs. So I've only mentioned but 2, but there are others. The gender issue was a really serious issue. I think there are still problems with single women obtaining finance in order to buy their own home. I understand that's still a problem. It shouldn't be, and so on. Now I want to go on, however, to mention the next biggest and very important special aspect of this, which is race discrimination. First Peoples are by a very large degree more likely not to be homeowners and more likely to be homeless than many others in their own land, which I think is something that needs to be elevated in the public debate. I remember when I was at Lake Tyers as a commissioner with the York Justice Commission a couple of years ago, speaking with an Aboriginal elder. I won't mention her name. That auntie said to me, this is such a serious problem in our area that when you go home to the hotel at Lake's Entrance tonight, I invite you to go on a walk just a kilometre or 2, and what you will see is several young people with backpacks on their back. They're not hiking, she said. That's their home. And she named who those people were. I did that. I did see those people. That's happening in every community close to Aboriginal communities throughout Victoria.
All right, one last question.
Right.
In-house from Sarah.
Sarah? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Very much. I'm Sarah Mackenzie. I'm from Capita.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, in the human rights framework, if you could talk a bit more about the elements of what the right to housing is. So I know you touched on them a bit, but one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently, not just that it's close to services or that it's a secure housing, but maybe it's not a right, but the ability for people to stay within their community as we move more towards a renting situation
Yep.
as well. One of my worries is, and I'm in my early 30s, is this is the time when people like me in my age are starting to put really strong roots down in our community or have those, and the fear of needing to leave for housing, but it's not just about the roof, but it's about what's next to the roof. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Some outstanding work informed by gifted international scholars, not just in human rights, but in housing, in architecture, in social science, gathered together under the auspices of ICESCA, the International Covenant on the Civil and Political Rights. That's supervised by CESCA, the Committee for that Right, in Geneva. And they wrote a document. It's called a general comment, but it's a bit understated, frankly, because it's really the genesis of what we understand the human right to housing to involve. These are sometimes called the decency principles, for the idea that it's the right of all of us to be able to live in a decent home. Legal security of tenure, to which you referred, availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure, affordability, which means no more than 30% of household income, habitability, accessibility, that's not just physical accessibility like a ramp for someone disabled, but being able to have the place at all, refers to the market being accessible, location, to which you referred, and cultural adequacy, which calls up the special interests of Indigenous people and other people with particular cultural practices. So it's a rich concept. Each of those, perhaps it might be best if I simply send you the link to the general comment. That might be the easiest thing. It's referred to in the book. I don't go into this in any great depth, but that's where you'll find it. It's a bit the answer to Lucy's question as well, because there are certain social interests, child interests, that are associated with home interests, and you can see those, separated out a bit in that document.
Yeah, I will. I suppose it's just we're having issues in Australia with social cohesion. Right?
We are, yes.
One of the things I think that really fights that
Yes.
that ability for you to be part of a community, to be accountable
Absolutely.
to each other, to see each other. And
Absolutely.
if
Well,
we're moving every 3 years or every year or something in and out of these communities.
Well, look, we're all here people with families, or most of us I would think. I've got social cohesion issues with my daughter who lives 40 kilometres away. We've had to, there's all manner of issues. I shouldn't even be talking about myself because you're in your 30s and it really affects you deeply. So, and I acknowledge that, and I acknowledge your bravery in taking on this issue because you've got a personal stake in it and it can't be easy. So good luck with your work. Yep. Now, Brian had a question, and
okay.
I think, did Brian have a question or did...
Renata
No,
asked.
it was Renata, was it? A bit late in the day, all right, okay.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Please join me to thank, I'll take this off here. To thank Kevin. Could have kept going all day, but you can pick up a copy of this essay now if you would like to for $19.95, and a lot of those questions are answered within it. It is a really good read, and like all the national interest essays, just the right length to read on a plane between Melbourne and Sydney, or just before you go to bed. So thank you very much, Kevin. It is a really terrific essay and a very important conversation that we need to be having, and I'm thrilled that we can be part of it. Next month, on October the 16th, we will be joined by one of the founding fellows of Per Capita, Dennis Glover, who's going to talk to us about his book, Repeat, A Warning from History, which looks at many of the issues with trust in democracy, rising populism and extremism today, compares them to what happened in the first half of the 20th century. So Dennis will be our speaker next month. But if you haven't already saved the date for the John Cain Memorial Oration, our third annual John Cain Memorial Oration at the State Library of Victoria, will be on Wednesday the 13th of November. Tickets will be available very soon. And in keeping with today's conversation, I'm delighted to say our speaker will be the Honourable Claire O'Neill, the new Housing Minister. So if you want to talk about policy and politics, come along on the 13th and you can hopefully catch the ear of the Minister as well. And just in response to Renata's, we did a report on called Glass Ceilings, Gendered Inequality in the Housing System within our centre earlier this year, was it? Or late last year? And Julie Riley from Australians Investing in Women is also here doing some really interesting work around those issues with Julie as well. So lots of attention being paid. I know many of you support Per Capita. We're very grateful that you do so, even if just coming along every month and giving us your ideas. Many of you support us financially. We're very grateful, and the money that you give us goes into the important work that we're trying to do to